day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Turnitin. My name is Chooks, and with me in the house today is Mulyadi Robin. Mulyadi, can you tell us a bit about your academic background, your work with the Australian Institute of Business, and your role and learning focus as a researcher?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Mulyadi, and I tend to introduce myself as a Chinese Indonesian living in Australia, more specifically in Adelaide. I am the Associate Dean Teaching and Learning at the Australian Institute of Business. And prior to joining the AIB, I held academic appointments at various places like Monash University, the University of Melbourne, and most recently at Alpha Crucis College. My area of research tends to focus around servant leadership, as well as the unintended outcomes of good practices. As a side, I also tend to do quite a number of research looking at specifically international students. And both my research into servant leadership as well as international students tend to feed into both my sort of teaching as well as consulting practices. So I hope that answers your question.
Just before we get into the aspect of servant leadership, which hopefully you could share a little bit about, but just curious to know that with the current climate, how do you see teaching and learning changing in the context of a possible return to campus post-COVID?
Yep, great question. Look, I think honestly, given the new normal that we're in at the moment, I think we're going to find it very hard to actually return back to pre-COVID days in terms of engaging, how you engage students. You know, one of the biggest challenges has always been that we haven't quite evolved. I mean, we've looked at blended learning practices and stuff like that, but I don't think we've actually quite caught up with the times with regards to how do we engage students in this fast-paced sort of, bombardment of sensory for students. And I think post-COVID, we'll find that we can't go back to just the normal lecture, sort of individual-driven, lecture-driven sort of classes and really didactic learning. I think what COVID has done is put learning to the forefront of the students and put a lot of responsibility onto the students' hands. And what that means is that both as a practitioner, as a facilitator or lecturer, we actually have to change our styles as much as students would have to adapt to what that might look like.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you. Knowing that there will be a change in how we approach teaching, learning, and designing courses, do you think universities are ready in dealing with the fact that most of those courses might have to go fully online? And what are some strategies that may be applied to ensure that there's a successful transition?
Yep, and I think not all universities are ready. I think thinking about moving online, it's not just about recording content and putting it out there, like I know many of my colleagues have done in the recent times. When it comes to sort of moving online, it's really about reimagining the pedagogical approaches of how we interact with the students and how we treat the learning materials itself. So for instance, at AIB, we hold dearly to this concept of andragogy, which is the adult learner, that we encourage the learners to actually participate in the learning process and not drive the learning process as educators ourselves. And I think that for universities to be ready, we've got to think about different ways of how we can actually engage students and really focus on the learning pathways. And there's a lot of sort of good research being done, good practices being done that's sort of flown under the radar because obviously, sort of online learning isn't quite seen as ideal. But what we've seen at AIB over the last couple of years, we're Australia's #1 provider of MBAs within the online space. And we know that that can be done and that can be done excellently.
Perfect. Just leaning into that a little bit more, I know you shared a little bit about some approaches or you've talked about how universities will have to rethink how we design a course. Let's look at the aspect of online assessments. What are some successful pedagogical practices that you can share with us that have informed successful design and when we're looking at the delivery of the courses and assessments in particular?
So I mean, one thing that we've found really helpful is to focus on this notion of authentic assessments and ensuring that assessments are actually practical and not just an abstracted concept. I think one of the hardest bits with moving online is the fact that, so much of you don't get this one-on-one interaction that you would normally get within a learning environment. If you're face-to-face, you get to know the students really well, because even though it might be an hour or so interaction, there is that physical engagement that happens. And sometimes some of that can get lost online, especially with poor internet connections, having to hide some videos, or students who choose to just really watch recorded content rather than participate in things like live webinars. So when it comes to looking at assessment design, I think, ensuring that the assessments are practical in that it measures and it meets all of the required learning outcomes, but making it really practical and personal, where you engage the individual, whether it's, locating it within a workplace or within a particular context where the students can actually engage in, and encouraging them to actually look at how theories can be applied into practice. I think that we found that really useful at the AIB. And moving away from things like examinations. I know this is kind of controversial, but examinations don't tend to draw out really, I think, practical learning out of what students, what we expect students to do. Yes, it measures, it can be quantification of learning outcomes in a way, but there's also that element of rote learning. And, I'm pretty sure, as Turnitin is being used for things like, as a tool, right, to prevent as well as to identify cases of academic misconduct. Examinations opens itself up to many different ways of many creative ways of actually being able to really engage in academic misconduct practices. So for us, we focus on ensuring that assessments are really practical, requiring the students to really engage in the assessment topics using practical examples. And we find that not only engages the students, we actually are able to see specific learning outcomes that we want to see from our students.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I'm just going to piggyback on something you mentioned earlier, which is around servant leadership.
Sure.
So, and we're just going to tie into the last question, which was around successful pedagogical practices. So, as a servant leader, how have you led the adoption of these best practices as dean, and how do you measure success?
Sure. Yep. And so servant leadership is one of those terms that I think often gets a little bit confused. It's really not so much of a soft approach to leadership, but it's really about a leadership approach that prioritizes the development of individuals. And in my research, part of what I'm passionate about is actually looking at how developing others actually lead to better outcomes. It's really, about having altruistic motivation as a leader, that I am in this because I really want to see my people develop and grow. And what I've seen, since joining AIB and being able to engage, really put into practice. And I hope when my colleagues are watching this, they go, yep, you've done that, rather than, oh, he's just not really practicing what he's preaching. But really about, focusing on the development and asking questions like, hey, is there anything that I can do as your leader to enable you to teach more effectively, to enable you to engage with your research more effectively, to enable you to engage with your students more effectively. And what we've seen is really, over COVID, and, kudos to not just myself, but also the executive team at AIB, where we've really held this human first, people first approach to leadership. We've seen that our staff members are highly engaged during, times of crisis like COVID, because, as the great Sam Walton, once upon a time when Walmart was becoming great, he said, when you look after your employees will look after your business for you. And what we've seen is that truly, even in the teaching and learning environment, is that when we are enabling our followers, the people we report, who to us, that actually has a great impact, because they take ownership of the students, they take ownership of their job really, really seriously. And I think you can see that in the high levels of student engagement that we've got, but also amazingly high level of, student evaluation of teaching and learning. So it's been really great to see that happen, with not just within research, but actually outside of it as well.
Yeah, good. I think it's always essential that we measure success about whatever practices or best practices we say we're applying, and at the same time, look at opportunities to improve as we go on. You did mention earlier about authentic assessment and the practicality and making it personal in terms of achieving valuable student outcomes. Now, how would you say assessments has changed from when we look at the design to delivery, and what role is technology playing in informing learning and supporting academic integrity?
Sure. Multiple points there to address. I think absolutely right. We've evolved from really a didactic form of assessment where it's really as much of multiple choice tests, exam, to actually engaging intellectually with the students and ensuring that assessments are meaningful. I think over the last few years, I've seen assessments evolve quite a fair bit in terms of engaging beyond just a descriptor to actually engaging in practical application. And at AIB, we pride ourselves as being the practical business school. And part of that is what we found is that when you make assessments practical, students have to engage with it because they can't just regurgitate content off the internet, whether it's a form of indirect plagiarism or direct plagiarism, right? And it actually makes it really difficult, even for things like contract cheating. And it's interesting that you mentioned the role of technology. I think technology enhanced learning services, there are many that helps you with writing services, picking up grammatical errors, helping you write, helping you research, but also tools like Turnitin where you actually get direct real-time feedback when it comes to, have I actually paraphrased things correctly? Have I understood what what is meant by synthesizing from different sources, which is not really, making a sentence out of 5 different sentences, but really reading, understanding, and rewriting it in your own words. And I think that technology-enhanced learning services not only has a part to play, it actually will be part of the future landscape of academia altogether.
Oh, great. I was actually I heard you say AIB is known as a practical business school, and I was going to actually ask that question.
Sure.
AIB is actually famous for being the institution that involves a lot of practicality in the courses, and I think other institutions of higher learning are looking to learn from the AIB experience. So for me, knowing over the years working with academics, it's always about what are the theories that underpin their approach to doing that. So are there any, what theories would come to mind for you that supports the successful delivery of online courses at AIB?
Sure. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, andragogy is definitely one that we utilize, right? When, it's really about engaging the learners. And that is what's meant by that is that we don't treat our students as if they don't know anything. In, the traditional academic environment, and I was guilty of this probably for the first 10 years of my academic career, I come in as the content expert. And what I do is I tell the students, and I become almost like a newsreader, right? Hey, here are the facts. I'm presenting it to you. Or I'm like a vlogger who basically, spot propaganda or a product review. Whereby andragogy and really the practical business school, what we take a look at is that our students come, we mostly do MBAs and above, right? Master's level programs and above. But I think this approach is doable even at the undergraduate level, in that we treat our students not as people who don't know anything, but as individuals with a wealth of knowledge. So for instance, we've got, people who are managing directors of not-for-profit organizations who are coming in to do a formal degree. Now, there's a lot of practical knowledge in there that they already have and they bring to the table. What they don't have and what they lack is this theoretical clarity or theoretical sort of frameworks that they can bring and make sense of their experiences and think about ways to actually be able to go forward further with this. So what we've done is, at AIB, when we engage students as online learning facilitators, which is what we call our lecturers, we act more like talk show where, we've got the framework in mind, but we try to coax the best out of our students in terms of, hey, here's the theory that you've read about. What does that look like practically? Where does the theory, sort of fall short? Where does the theory strengthen? And some of our students basically say, hey, this gives us words to be able to explain what we've actually been thinking and doing over the last 10 to 15 years. And I believe that, while at the postgraduate level, I think it makes perfect sense. Thinking back, looking at even some of the undergraduate students, or even, at diploma level, you can actually engage with them in that way, because what we know is that, everyone has got their own experiences. And when you contextualize learning, whether it's in practice as a practical learning, or, contextualized learning as a personal element of learning, you actually do learn better.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the things I used to do in my learning design career is actually encourage that academics think about students as needing to connect the dots in learning, and I think that's that's what you're referring to in terms of context.
Thanks for listening. This concludes part 1 of our conversation. Please join us again for part 2.